Before we dive in, viewer discretion is advised. This content is for entertainment. What happens when America's most famous television psychologist walks into a talk show that spent years diagnosing a political figure from afar, armed with actual clinical definitions and a willingness to hold up a mirror that nobody asked for? When someone trained in reading human behavior encounters hosts whose behavior reveals far more than their words ever could, when a question designed to get professional validation for pre-existing political hatred backfires spectacularly because the expert refuses to play along with armchair psychology, what you're about to witness is not just another political debate or partisan argument. This is a moment Dr. Phil, a man who spent decades actually treating patients rather than diagnosing public figures from television studios, reminded everyone that psychology is a science, not a political weapon. This is Joy Behar discovering that inviting a real expert onto your show can backfire when that expert has integrity. This is what happens when someone asks for professional opinion, expecting validation, and gets education instead. Dr. Phil walked onto View that day knowing exactly what they wanted from him: professional endorsement of their political positions, expert confirmation that their targets were mentally ill, ammunition they could use to justify their pre-existing contempt. What he gave them instead was a masterclass in how actual psychology works, a mirror held up to their own behavior, and a reminder that clinical diagnosis requires more than watching someone on television and deciding you don't like them. Joy Behar thought she was setting up a softball question that would let Dr. Phil validate everything The View had been saying for years. Instead, she got schooled on the difference between psychology and political theater, between clinical diagnosis and partisan hatred. And the look on her face when she realized what was happening, that priceless moment when someone discovers their trap has caught them instead of their target, that alone was worth the price of admission. Buckle up, because what unfolds isn't just good television. It's a lesson in how real expertise looks when it refuses to be weaponized for political purposes, how science operates when it maintains its integrity despite pressure to abandon it, and what happens when someone finally calls out the armchair diagnosticians who've been playing doctor for ratings. The View studio hummed with its familiar energy that morning, the hosts settling into their seats with the comfortable confidence of people who performed this routine thousands of times. The topic had been predetermined, the narrative arc planned out, the beats carefully choreographed to deliver exactly the kind of content their audience expected. Political commentary wrapped in the language of concern, partisan attacks disguised as legitimate questions. Dr. Phil sat across from them with the relaxed authority of someone who'd been in front of cameras for decades, who navigated countless interviews, who understood media dynamics but wasn't controlled by them. He carried himself with that distinctive combination of Southern charm and professional expertise that had made him a household name, approachable but authoritative, friendly but not easily manipulated. The conversation had flowed through various topics, building toward the moment Joy had been preparing for all morning. She'd done her research, prepared her question, constructed what she believed was an airtight setup that would let Dr. Phil confirm everything The View had been saying about their favorite political target. This was supposed to be validation, professional endorsement of positions they'd already committed to. But Joy had made a fundamental miscalculation. She'd assumed Dr. Phil would prioritize being a good guest over being a good psychologist. She'd forgotten that some people's professional integrity matters more to them than television appearances or audience approval. She was about to learn that lesson the hard way. So, Joy began, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who thinks they're being clever. You can't diagnose anybody from afar. Somebody that haven't examined, doctors, therapists, but a lot of respected psychologists out there, really big-time big names, are saying that Donald Trump is showing signs of narcissism. She paused for effect, clearly believing she framed this perfectly, which, by the way, one of the symptoms is being preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited power, success, and brilliance, and they're questioning that he has narcissistic disorder. Number one, do you think that's a mental illness, narcissism? And if so, is he fit to be president? The question hung in the air, loaded with assumptions, and designed to force a particular answer. But Dr. Phil had been doing this far too long to fall into such an obvious trap. Well, counselor, doctor. Phil began, his voice carrying amusement at the transparent setup. "That's a compound question, and I object." The audience laughed, but Dr. Phil wasn't making a joke. He was already establishing that he wouldn't be manipulated into answering loaded questions designed to produce predetermined conclusions. He was a psychologist, not a political operative, and he was about to demonstrate the difference. "You know, people talk about narcissism," he continued, pulling out actual notes, "but they don't really know what it means. So I brought a list from the DSM-5 about what narcissism really is. Because if I asked people to stand up and define it, they wouldn't know." This was already going off script. Joy had expected validation, not education. She wanted Dr. Phil to confirm that the political figure they despised was mentally ill. Instead, he was preparing to give an actual psychology lesson, complete with clinical definitions from the diagnostic manual that professionals actually use. "Let's just take a look," Dr. Phil said, reading from his notes. 1. Has a grandiose sense of self-importance. Before he could continue, Joy jumped in eagerly. "Check." 2. Is preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, or brilliance, which he said. "Check." Joy said again, clearly delighted that Dr. Phil seemed to be confirming her diagnosis. 3. Believe that he or she is special or unique, can only be understood by special people. "Check." Joy's voice carried triumph now, as if each item on the list was proving her point rather than building towards something else entirely. 4. Rakira's excessive admiration. "Oh, check." Joy was almost giddy now, convinced this was going exactly as she planned. Dr. Phil continued reading to the diagnostic criteria, his voice steady and clinical, letting Joy interrupt with her enthusiastic confirmations. Has a sense of entitlement, which means is very thin-skinned if criticized. Is interpersonally exploitative. Lacks empathy. Has the inability to stand in other people's shoes and understand. Like when he makes fun of people who are handicapped. Joy interjected, unable to resist adding her own interpretation. "I'm just reading it, Dr." Phil said calmly, a subtle warning that she was editorializing rather than listening. "You interpret however you want. Is often envious of others or believes that others are envious of him or her. Shows arrogant and haughty behaviors." He looked up from his notes with an expression that suggested the lesson was about to begin in earnest. "How many people does that describe?" Joy sensed something shifting, but couldn't quite see the trap she'd walked into. "That's a lot of people," she admitted. And then Dr. Phil delivered a line that would become the defining moment of the entire interview. The words that would be replayed thousands of times across social media. The statement that perfectly captured what had just happened. "Well, that is a lot of people," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable meaning. "And if you take out everybody that has any of those characteristics, then you're going to take out a lot of people, including some at this table." The silence that followed was deafening. The camera captured Joy's face perfectly. The moment when triumph turned to realization, when someone discovers they've been outplayed, when the mirror gets held up and the reflection isn't flattering. Her expression went through a visible transformation. Confusion, recognition, barely controlled anger, all flashing across her features in the span of seconds. Dr. Phil had just done something extraordinary. He'd taken Joy's attempt to use psychology as a political weapon and turned it into an actual psychological assessment, not of the political figure they wanted to attack, but of the people doing the attacking. He let them enthusiastically check off every symptom on the narcissism list, and then calmly pointed out that those same symptoms described them. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The audience, which had been eagerly following along with Joy's checks and confirmations, suddenly went quiet as the implications sank in. This wasn't the validation session they'd anticipated. This was a psychology professor catching his students in their own hypocrisy. Joy tried to recover, her voice rising with defensive indignation. "Things that we go through. You wouldn't look at President Obama and say he has narcissistic disorder. So you can't just say they all have it." But Dr. Phil wasn't backing down from the point he'd made. "People have all the things you said. We just checked every one of them." I said, most leaders are under a lot of stress and pressure. So a lot of them will show anxiety, depression at different times. A lot of leaders will have some affliction at different times because of the pressure and demands of the office. The brilliance of his response was multi-layered. First, he'd refused to weaponize psychology for political purposes. He wouldn't diagnose anyone he hadn't personally examined, regardless of political affiliation. Second, he'd pointed out that many personality traits exist on a spectrum, that what looks like narcissism from a distance might be normal leadership confidence, ego, or the psychological armor people develop to handle extraordinary pressure. Third, and most devastatingly, he'd used Joy's own eagerness to apply these labels to demonstrate that she possessed many of the same characteristics she was so quick to identify in others. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Here was a show that had spent years diagnosing a political figure from afar, that had invited countless experts to validate their armchair psychology, that had weaponized mental health terminology for political attacks, and the one time they brought on someone with actual expertise and professional ethics, he'd turned their weapon back on them. Joy's face had gone through several shades of red, her body language screaming discomfort even as she tried to maintain her composure. She'd expected an ally who would confirm her biases. Instead, she'd gotten a professional who'd expose those biases for what they were. Political hatred dressed up in psychological language. Partisan attacks wrapped in the legitimacy of clinical terminology. The confrontation revealed something profound about the difference between actual expertise and television expertise. Dr. Phil could have easily played along, could have given Joy the soundbite she wanted, could have used his credentials to validate whatever position would make him popular with the audience and hosts. Many television experts do exactly that. They understand their role is to provide professional-sounding confirmation of whatever narrative the show is pushing. But Dr. Phil had built his career on something more substantive than television popularity. He'd actually treated patients, had studied psychology at the highest levels, had maintained professional ethics even when they became inconvenient for his entertainment career. And in that moment, faced with a choice between being a good guest and being a good psychologist, he chose his professional integrity. The implications extended far beyond one interview or one political figure. Dr. Phil had just demonstrated what actual psychological assessment looks like versus the partisan performance that had been masquerading as mental health concern. Real psychology requires examination, context, understanding the full picture rather than cherry-picking behaviors that confirm pre-existing judgments. More importantly, he'd exposed a dangerous game of armchair diagnosis that had become so prevalent in political discourse. When you start deciding that political opponents must be mentally ill, when you weaponize clinical terminology for partisan purposes, when you use the language of psychology to delegitimize people you simply disagree with, you're not doing psychology, you're doing politics with medical veneer. And by calmly, almost casually pointing out that Joy herself exhibited many of the characteristics she was so eager to diagnose in others, Dr. Phil had revealed the fundamental projection at work. People who spend their days analyzing others' narcissism rarely stop to examine their own. People who are quickest to throw around clinical diagnoses of their enemies rarely apply those same standards to themselves. The audience, initially eager to hear professional confirmation of their political views, had witnessed something unexpected, an actual lesson in psychology that challenged rather than confirmed their assumptions. Some looked thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering how quickly they'd adopted armchair diagnosis. Others looked offensive, uncomfortable with having their certainty challenged. But Joy looked angry. Not the performative anger that she often deployed on the show for effect, but genuine frustration at being outmaneuvered in her own studio. She brought Dr. Phil on specifically to get ammunition for her political attacks, and instead he'd use his expertise to reflect her own behavior back at her. The remaining time in the segment was awkward, filled with attempts to redirect a conversation that never quite recovered the energy or purpose. Dr. Phil had accomplished something rare in modern television. He refused to let his expertise be weaponized, had maintained professional ethics despite pressure to abandon them, and had demonstrated that some people still value truth over tribal allegiance. As the interview concluded and Dr. Phil left the set, the host tried to process what had happened to make sense of a guest who'd refused to validate their narrative. But their analysis missed the point entirely because they were still operating within a framework that Dr. Phil had rejected the idea that psychology could and should be used as a political weapon. In the aftermath, as clips of the exchange spread across social media, reactions split along predictable lines. Those who shared Joy's political views accused Dr. Phil of being partisan himself, of defending someone who clearly exhibited problematic behavior. Those who opposed Joy's politics celebrated Dr. Phil for exposing the hypocrisy and projections so evident in her questioning. But the more thoughtful responses came from mental health professionals who recognized what Dr. Phil had actually done. He defended the integrity of their field against those who would reduce it to political theater. He'd reminded everyone that clinical diagnosis is serious business that requires training, examination, and professional ethics, not television appearances and political hatred. This is why the Goldwater Rule exists, one psychologist noted, referring to the American Psychiatric Association's ethical guideline against diagnosing public figures you haven't personally examined. Dr. Phil just demonstrated why it's so important. When you start diagnosing from afar based on behavior you don't like, you're not doing psychology, you're doing politics. Another observation captured the deeper significance. Watch Joy's face when Dr. Phil says, including some at this table. That's the moment she realizes she's been describing herself. That's what projection looks like when it gets called out. The brilliance of Dr. Phil's approach was in its simplicity. He didn't refuse to discuss narcissism or claim it wasn't a real condition. He didn't defend or attack any specific political figure. He simply laid out the actual clinical criteria. Let Joy eagerly confirm that those criteria described someone she hated, and then pointed out that those same criteria described a lot of people, including people sitting right there in the studio. By refusing to play the game Joy wanted him to play, by maintaining his professional integrity instead of becoming another political operative with credentials, Dr. Phil had done something increasingly rare in modern media. He'd valued truth over team loyalty, substance over spectacle, professional ethics over entertainment value. Joy Behar had invited an expert onto her show, expecting validation. What she got instead was education, mirror holding, and a reminder that expertise means something beyond simply having the credentials to say what people want to hear. Real experts maintain standards even when those standards become inconvenient. Real professionals refuse to weaponize their fields for political purposes. Real integrity looks like choosing to be right over choosing to be popular. The broader lesson extended far beyond the view or one political figure, or even psychology specifically. In a culture where expertise had been increasingly weaponized for partisan purposes, where credentials were often used to provide professional-sounding confirmation of political positions rather than actual expertise, Dr. Phil had demonstrated what integrity looks like when it refuses to be compromised. He'd shown that you could disagree with someone politically without diagnosing them with mental illness. You could recognize problematic behavior without reducing it to clinical pathology. You could maintain your professional standards even when pressure and opportunity align to suggest abandoning them. Most importantly, he revealed the dangerous narcissism, real narcissism, not political diagnosis of people who spend their days analyzing others without ever examining themselves. The eagerness with which Joy had checked off every symptom of narcissism when applied to someone she hated, combined with her complete blindness to those same symptoms in herself, perfectly illustrated the projection and lack of self-awareness that characterizes actual narcissistic behavior. The View moved on to its next segment, next guest, next controversy. The news cycle continued. But for those who'd witnessed that moment, something important had been demonstrated: that expertise still mattered when exercised with integrity. That professional standard still existed even when culture pressured people to abandon them. And that sometimes the most powerful thing an expert can do is refuse to let their expertise be weaponized for purposes it was never intended to serve. Dr. Phil left that studio exactly as he'd entered it, professionally credible, ethically grounded, unwilling to compromise his standards for anyone's convenience. He hadn't won any political points or gained any partisan allies. What he'd done was something more valuable. He defended the integrity of his field, had reminded everyone that clinical psychology is a science, not a political weapon, and had demonstrated that some people still value being right over being popular. Joy Behar had tried to use psychology to attack her political opponents. Dr. Phil had used psychology to reveal her own behavior. And in that simple reversal, in that moment when the mirror got turned around, everyone watching learned something about projection, about narcissism, and about what happens when you invite a real expert expecting validation and get education instead. That's what made the moment memorable and significant, not because it settled any political debate or proved anyone right or wrong about any specific figure, but because it demonstrated that truth still matters more than tribe, that integrity still exists even when convenience suggests abandoning it, and that some people still refuse to let their expertise be reduced to ammunition in culture wars. Dr. Phil had been asked to diagnose someone from afar for political purposes. He'd refused and instead held up a mirror. And what that mirror revealed about projection, about narcissism, about the people doing the diagnosing rather than the person being diagnosed was far more illuminating than any partisan soundbite could have been. The look on Joy Behar's face when she realized what had happened, when the trap she'd set caught her instead of her target, when the psychology lesson she requested became a lesson about her own behavior. That moment captured everything. The discomfort of seeing yourself clearly, the anger at having assumptions challenged, the recognition that expertise means something beyond simply confirming what you already believe. Dr. Phil had given the View exactly what they needed, even if it wasn't what they wanted. Not validation, but education, not ammunition, but insight, not confirmation of their biases, but a mirror reflecting their own behavior back at them. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that real expertise exercised with real integrity sometimes means telling people what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear. Even when that makes you unpopular, even when that costs you opportunities, even when that means being the villain in someone else's narrative rather than the hero in your own.